You're a forensic psychologist in 1945, and you've been asked to explain the impossible. How does a 13-year-old girl who discovers her mother's suicide transform into a 22-year-old woman who laughs as she sends children to gas chambers? How does an apprentice hairdresser seeking a better salary become someone who beats elderly women to death for sport? How does a 50-year-old former missionary turn into a person who trains dogs to tear prisoners apart? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are real transformations that happened to three women: Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. And here's what should terrify you. These weren't monsters who were born evil. They were ordinary people who became monsters through a process that psychological research suggests could happen to almost anyone under the right conditions. Today, we're not just telling you what they did. We're going to analyze how ordinary psychology becomes extraordinary evil using modern psychological frameworks that didn't exist in 1945. This is a forensic psychological autopsy of how trauma, ideology, and power corrupt the human mind. And I need to warn you, by the end of this video, you're going to realize something uncomfortable about yourself. Something about human nature that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. But understanding this truth might be the most important thing you learn this year. Because it's not just about history. It's about recognizing the same patterns in our world today, in our communities, and potentially in ourselves. Let's begin with a question that will haunt you. What's the difference between you and a war criminal? You probably think it's something fundamental. Something in your character, your values, your soul. But what if I told you the difference might be nothing more than circumstances, environment, and a series of small choices that snowball into the unthinkable? Let me introduce you to a psychological concept called trauma reenactment, because understanding this is crucial to everything that follows. When someone experiences severe powerlessness during a traumatic event, their brain doesn't just file it away as a bad memory. Instead, the trauma creates what psychologists call a psychological wound that never fully heals. And here's where it gets dark. Some people who experience this kind of trauma compulsively recreate scenarios where they can reverse the power dynamic. The victim becomes the victimizer, not in spite of their trauma, but because of it. It's a twisted form of psychological healing, where the person tries to master the trauma by inflicting it on others. Now let's apply this to Irma Grese. October 1935, 12-year-old. Irma comes home from school in rural Recken, Germany. Population 175. Everyone knows everyone. She finds her mother Bertha dying from drinking hydrochloric acid. Stop and imagine that for a moment. Not just the horror of finding your mother dying, but the way she chose to die. Hydrochloric acid is one of the most painful suicide methods imaginable. It burns your esophagus, your stomach, everything it touches. Death takes hours, and the agony is indescribable. Why did Bertha choose this particular method? Because she'd discovered her husband Alfred was having an affair with the daughter of the local pub owner. And in a small village in 1935 Germany, everyone would know. The betrayal wasn't just private, it was public. Everyone in Recken would know that Alfred Grese had humiliated his wife so badly that she killed herself. So Bertha chose a death that was equally public in its violence. Her pain would be visible to everyone, and 12-year-old Irma was the one who found her. Imagine being 12 years old and discovering your mother like this. Imagine the trauma, the rage, the helplessness, the smell, the sounds, the image seared into your brain forever. According to modern trauma psychology, when children witness a parent's suicide, they often develop what's called learned helplessness, the belief that they have no control over catastrophic events in their lives. But there's a second pattern that's equally common. Some children develop the opposite response. They become obsessed with control, with power, with making sure they're never helpless again. Guess which pattern Irma followed? Within months, villagers in Rechen noticed changes in the young girl. Irma, previously a shy girl who avoided conflicts, began to withdraw from everyone around her. She'd stand alone on hills, whistling like some boy, showing no interest in friends her age. Her sister Helene, who would later testify at Irma's trial, said that Irma would run away from schoolyard fights rather than participate in them. She was incapable of standing up for herself when challenged by other girls. But here's the critical detail that most documentaries skip. Running away from fights isn't pacifism. It's not gentleness or kindness. It's avoidance driven by a terror of powerlessness. Irma wasn't gentle. She was terrified of being weak, of being in a position where someone else had power over her. That fear would eventually transform into its opposite, an obsession with having absolute power over others. And then, in 1936, just months after Bertha's death, her father Alfred married his mistress, the same woman whose affair had driven Bertha to suicide. Now, Irma lived in a home with the woman who had replaced her dead mother. Every single day was a reminder of her mother's humiliation and death. Imagine the rage building inside this traumatized teenager, the helplessness, the daily reminder that her father had chosen this woman over her mother. Psychologists call this environmental invalidation, when your living situation constantly triggers your unresolved trauma, making healing impossible. Irma needed an escape. She needed power. She needed to feel like she mattered, like she had control over something in her life. And then she discovered the League of German Girls, the BDM, the female equivalent of Hitler Youth. Here's what makes Nazi ideology so psychologically effective. And this is crucial to understand. It doesn't just offer you an enemy to hate. It offers you a narrative that explains your pain and gives you permission to express your rage in socially acceptable ways. For traumatized, alienated young people like Irma, Nazi ideology said, "Your suffering isn't your fault. It's not because of your mother's suicide or your father's betrayal or your own powerlessness. It's because Germany has been weakened by inferior races. The Jews, the Slavs, the mentally ill, the disabled, they're the ones who caused all this suffering. You're not powerless. You're part of a superior race destined to rule. You're not worthless. You're Aryan, the pinnacle of human evolution. Your pain has purpose. Your rage is justified. And we'll give you targets for that rage." When Irma's father forbade her from joining the BDM, what did she do? She joined anyway. This is rebellion, yes, but it's also the first time in her narrative that she has power. She makes decisions. She defies authority. She chooses her own path. By age 15, she'd left home entirely, working odd jobs, trying desperately to become a nurse. She wanted to help people, to heal, to matter in a positive way. But here's the detail that reveals everything about where her psychology was heading. In 1943, when Irma was 19 and already working at concentration camps, she went home to visit her father. She wore her full SS uniform. Why? This wasn't necessary. She could have worn civilian clothes. She could have tried to reconcile with him. But she wanted her father to see her in uniform. She wanted him to see that she had power now, that she wasn't the helpless child anymore, that she mattered, that she was somebody. During that visit, something happened that gives us a window into the darkness growing inside Irma. Her father had remarried and had young stepchildren living in the house. One of them, a little girl, had a doll. Just an innocent child's toy, probably her most treasured possession. Irma took that doll and systematically tore it apart, ripped off the head, tore off the limbs, destroyed it completely. The little girl came crying to Alfred. Then his young son picked up Irma's revolver and playfully pointed it at him, not understanding the danger. Alfred snapped. He grabbed the gun from the boy and struck Irma with it, then ordered her out of his house forever. She would never see him again. At her trial in 1945, When her sister Helene testified about this incident, it was the only time during the entire trial that Irma showed emotion. She broke down sobbing, not for her victims, but for her lost relationship with her father. Now ask yourself, why did she destroy a child's doll? What does that act tell us about her psychology? Modern psychology has a term for this: destruction of innocence. Irma's own innocence had been destroyed when she found her mother dying. She'd been robbed of childhood security, of the belief that parents protect you and the world is safe. And when faced with a symbol of the innocence she'd lost, a child's beloved doll representing everything pure and protected in childhood, she had to destroy it. She couldn't bear to see that innocence in someone else when hers had been so violently taken. This is trauma reenactment in its purest form. And this is the young woman who was about to be given absolute power over 30,000 female prisoners at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But before we get to Auschwitz, we need to understand the other two women, because their pathways to evil were completely different, and in some ways even more disturbing because they show us that you don't need trauma to become a monster. Let's talk about Elisabeth Volkenrath, because her story destroys the comfortable narrative that only damaged people do evil things. Elisabeth wasn't traumatized. She came from a stable working-class family. No abuse, no suicide, no dramatic childhood tragedy. She worked as a hairdresser's apprentice, living an ordinary life in an ordinary German town. So why did she volunteer to become a concentration camp guard? Money. In 1941, when recruitment began for female guards, the SS was offering 185 Reichsmarks per month. Factory workers, which is what most working-class women could expect to earn, made 76 Reichsmarks per month. That's a 143% salary increase. For a young woman with limited education and few prospects, this was an opportunity for real upward mobility. Elisabeth saw a career opportunity, and she took it. Here's what's chilling about this. She wasn't ideologically committed initially. She wasn't even a member of the Nazi Party. She didn't hate Jews with some burning passion. She just wanted more money and better career prospects. This is what psychologists call moral disengagement through economic incentive, and studies of genocide perpetrators from Rwanda to Cambodia to Nazi Germany show that economic motivation is often more dangerous than ideological commitment. Why? Because when you join for ideology, however twisted, there's still a moral framework. You believe you're doing something right, something necessary, something justified. But when you join for money, you've already made a calculation before you even start. My financial benefit is worth more than whatever suffering might result. You've already dehumanized the victims before you even meet them. You've already decided that your bank account matters more than their lives. Elisabeth didn't need to be convinced that Jews were subhuman. She just needed to be convinced that 185 Reichsmarks was worth not caring what happened to them. And here's the insidious part. Once you've made that moral compromise, once you've crossed that line for money, it becomes easier to cross the next line. And the next. Psychologists call this moral creep, the gradual erosion of ethical boundaries. Through small compromises that individually seem minor, but cumulatively transform you into someone unrecognizable. Elisabeth's first job was supervising work details, just watching prisoners work, making sure they didn't escape. Easy. Then she participated in selections, pointing left or right, work or death. A bit harder, but you could tell yourself you were just following orders, just doing your administrative duty. Then she started beating prisoners who didn't work fast enough. Now you're personally inflicting pain, but you could justify it as maintaining discipline. Then she beat prisoners to death. Now you're a murderer, but somehow the distance from That first job, supervising work details to this moment, didn't feel like such a huge leap because each step was just slightly worse than the last. Each step seemed like a small escalation from the previous one, barely worth noticing. But cumulatively, she went from hairdresser to mass murderer, and she did it for a paycheck. There was no grand ideological conviction, no traumatic childhood driving her. Just ambition, money, and a willingness to compromise her morality in small increments. Now let's talk about Johanna Bormann, because she represents perhaps the most disturbing case of all. She demolishes every assumption we have about who can become evil. Born in 1893, Johanna was 45 years old when she entered the camp system, old enough to be Irma's mother, old enough to have lived an entire adult life before the Nazis even came to power. And here's what makes her case so troubling. In her youth, she'd done missionary work. She had religious convictions. She believed in God, in helping others, in Christian charity. So what happened? How does a middle-aged missionary become a woman who trains dogs to tear prisoners apart? The simple answer is, she needed a job. The Great Depression had devastated Germany's economy. Jobs were scarce, especially for middle-aged women with limited skills. When the concentration camp system started hiring, Johanna applied. She started in the kitchen, doing non-violent work, behind the scenes, just preparing meals for SS staff. It seemed like a normal job, just cooking, nothing sinister. But here's what psychologists have discovered about environments of normalized evil. They don't require you to be evil when you enter. They make you evil through a process called normalization of deviance. Every day, Johanna saw violence against prisoners. Every day, she saw human beings treated as less than animals. Every day, the abnormal became more normal. And here's the key psychological mechanism. When everyone around you treats cruelty as routine, your brain recalibrates what's acceptable. It has to, because cognitive dissonance, holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, is psychologically painful. So your brain resolves the dissonance by adjusting your moral framework to match your environment. It's not that Johanna's religious values disappeared overnight. It's that she created a mental separation, what psychologists call moral compartmentalization. These aren't really people, they're prisoners. These aren't God's children, they're enemies of the Reich. Different rules apply to them. My Christian values still hold for real people. But these prisoners, they're different. They're other. They're less than human. Within months, Johanna wasn't just working in the kitchen. She was supervising prisoners. Within a year, she had a German shepherd that she trained to attack prisoners on command. Within 2 years, she was ordering that dog to tear women apart while she watched. The missionary became a murderer, not through a dramatic conversion or crisis of faith, but through gradual moral erosion in an environment where cruelty was the norm and kindness was punished. Now we need to understand how the Nazi system transformed these 3 women, because this isn't just about individual psychology. It's about environmental design. The SS didn't just randomly brutalize people. They had a sophisticated psychological system for creating brutal guards. And understanding this system is crucial because similar patterns appear in every genocide, every authoritarian regime, every situation where ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities. Ravensbrück concentration camp, where all 3 women trained, wasn't just a prison. It was a training facility specifically designed to create brutal female guards. And the training methods were psychologically sophisticated in ways that are honestly terrifying when you understand them. Let me walk you through the actual training process, because understanding this is crucial to understanding how ordinary people become capable of genocide. Phase 1 was desensitization. New guards were immediately exposed to extreme suffering. They watched experienced guards beat prisoners. They participated in forced labor supervision where prisoners collapsed from exhaustion. They saw people die. They saw violence as routine. The goal was to overwhelm the natural empathy response. When you see suffering constantly, your brain has 2 options: maintain empathy and experience constant distress, or deactivate empathy to protect yourself from psychological pain. Most people in that environment choose option 2. It's not because they're evil. It's because the human brain is designed to protect itself from overwhelming distress. Empathy is painful when you can't stop the suffering you're witnessing, so the brain shuts it down. This is a survival mechanism, but in this context, it becomes a mechanism for creating cruelty. Phase 2 was authority justification. Guards were taught that they represented the authority of the Reich. Any disobedience from prisoners was an attack on German authority itself, an attack on Germany, an attack on everything the guards were supposed to represent. This is what psychologist Stanley Milgram would later demonstrate in his famous experiments. People will commit terrible acts when they believe they're following legitimate authority, when they can tell themselves that the responsibility lies with the authority figure giving orders, not with them personally. Phase 3 was dehumanization through language. Prisoners were never called by names. They were pieces, material, dreck, garbage. They were numbers, not people. This linguistic dehumanization is crucial, and modern neuroscience research has shown why. When people use dehumanizing language consistently, their brain literally processes the targets differently. fMRI studies show that when people use dehumanizing language about a group, the parts of their brain associated with empathy and social cognition show reduced activity when thinking about that group. The language literally rewires how your brain processes these humans. They become objects in your mind, not people. And once that mental transformation happens, cruelty becomes much easier because you're not hurting a person. You're just managing objects, dealing with problems, processing material. Phase 4 was the reward system, and this is the part most people don't understand. Cruelty wasn't just permitted, it was rewarded. Guards who showed brutality got promotions. They got better quarters, better food, social approval from peers and superiors. They got respect and status. Guards who showed weakness, meaning basic human decency, were mocked by their peers, demoted, or transferred to less desirable positions. The environment created a system where your career advancement was directly tied to your capacity for cruelty. Think about what this does psychologically. If you're a young woman who joined for career advancement, like Elisabeth, you quickly learn that kindness is punished and cruelty is rewarded. Your brain, which is designed to seek rewards and avoid punishments, gradually adjusts your behavior to maximize rewards. You become crueler not because you're evil, but because the system has made cruelty the path to success. When Irma, Elisabeth and Johanna transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943, they entered the epicenter of industrial genocide. This wasn't Ravensbrück anymore. This was a death factory processing thousands of people daily. And here's what psychologists have discovered about such extreme environments. They create what's called reality distortion. When you're surrounded by mass death every single day, your sense of normal becomes completely warped. Things that would horrify a normal person in normal circumstances become routine administrative tasks. Irma participated in selections, pointing left for work or right for immediate death in gas chambers. At first, maybe this caused some psychological distress. Maybe she felt sick. Maybe she had nightmares. But after the 100th selection, the 1000th, it became a job, a task, no different than sorting mail or filing paperwork. Psychological studies of genocide perpetrators show that most don't remain in a state of constant moral crisis. Instead, they normalize the horror and develop routines that allow them to function. Irma developed her own routines and patterns. Survivors testified that she selected beautiful women for death first. Women she perceived as more attractive than herself went straight to the gas chambers. Why? On the surface, it seems like jealousy, and it was. But let's go deeper into what this reveals about her psychology. It shows that even in this environment of mass murder, even while participating in genocide, Irma still cared about appearance, about status, about how she compared to others. She was still a 20-year-old woman concerned about beauty and attractiveness and her place in social hierarchies, but she'd integrated these normal human concerns into a system of genocide. She dealt with her insecurity about her appearance by killing women who threatened that appearance. That's the horror of it. She remained human, with human insecurities and concerns, while becoming inhuman in her actions. She didn't transform into some monster who was unrecognizable as human. She remained recognizably human, which is what makes it so disturbing. Here's another critical factor in their transformation. These women had absolute power. Irma was 20 years old and controlled the lives of 30,000 women. She could kill anyone, anytime, for any reason or no reason at all. There were no checks, no balances, no oversight, no accountability. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison experiment, conducted in 1971, demonstrated what happens when you give ordinary people absolute power over others. Many become sadistic, and it happens fast. In Zimbardo's experiment, it took less than 6 days for college students randomly assigned to be guards to become cruel and abusive. Irma had that kind of absolute power for years. And unlike Zimbardo's experiment, there was no professor stopping the abuse. The entire system encouraged it. The whole structure was designed to facilitate and reward cruelty. Multiple survivors testified that Irma had sexual relationships with both male SS officers, including Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, who conducted horrific medical experiments, and with female prisoners. But here's what's important to understand psychologically. This wasn't about sexual orientation or desire in any normal sense. This was about power. Survivor Magda Hellinger, who later wrote a memoir about her time at Birkenau, described how Irma would develop intense friendships with female prisoners, sharing confidences, providing extra food, acting like a big sister, creating real emotional intimacy. Then, when she grew bored with them, or tired of them, or simply felt like it, she'd send them to the gas chambers. Imagine the psychological torture of that. Imagine developing trust, even affection, with someone who had absolute power over your life, someone who seemed to care about you. Then imagine that person killing you, simply because they'd tired of you, the way you might throw away a toy you're bored with. This is psychological torture as entertainment, cruelty as a form of play. Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian Jewish doctor who was a prisoner at Birkenau, testified about something even more disturbing. She claimed that Irma would watch medical procedures on prisoners, surgeries with no anesthesia on infected whip wounds, and become visibly sexually aroused by the women's screams and suffering. What we're seeing here is what psychologists call sadistic paraphilia, sexual arousal from causing or witnessing suffering. But here's what's crucial to understand. This likely didn't exist before the camps. This wasn't some innate sexual deviation that Irma was born with. This developed in an environment where causing suffering was normalized, rewarded, and had no consequences. The environment didn't just permit sadism. It cultivated it, encouraged it, made it a source of pleasure and power and social status. Now we need to talk about specifics, about the actual methods these women used, because the details reveal psychology in ways that broad descriptions cannot. Most documentaries give you the headlines. They were cruel, they beat prisoners, they killed people. But the methods matter because they show us how these women were thinking, what psychological needs their cruelty was fulfilling. Irma carried a distinctive whip made from cellophane and wire, and she had a German shepherd that she kept deliberately underfed to make it aggressive. But here's what's psychologically revealing. Survivors testified that she didn't just beat people randomly. She had patterns, specific targets, particular methods. She specifically targeted women's breasts. Multiple survivors confirmed this pattern independently. She would whip women across the breasts repeatedly, causing wounds that would become infected, requiring surgery with no anesthesia. Why target the breasts specifically? This isn't about efficiency or following orders. This is about inflicting a specific type of gendered pain, attacking femininity itself, attacking the physical markers of womanhood. Combined with her pattern of selecting beautiful women for immediate death, what do we see? We see that Irma's cruelty was deeply intertwined with her own insecurities about appearance and femininity and her place in the hierarchy of desirability. She spent hours styling her hair. She had tailored uniforms made to accentuate her figure. She dreamed of being a movie star after the war. She was a young woman intensely concerned with beauty, with appearance, with how she looked and how others perceived her. And she weaponized that concern against her victims. She dealt with her insecurities by destroying the things that triggered those insecurities in others. If you were more beautiful than her, you died. If you had physical attributes she envied, she destroyed them. Elisabeth's methods were different, less flashy, but in some ways more systematic and therefore more dangerous. She implemented what was called sport, forced calisthenics for starving prisoners who could barely stand. Survivor testimony describes women having to kneel for 8 hours, holding heavy stones above their heads. If their arms dropped even slightly, Elisabeth would beat them unconscious with a rubber truncheon. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, she'd beat them where they lay. What's revealing about Elisabeth's methods? This is cruelty disguised as discipline. It has the veneer of order, of rules, of legitimate punishment for infractions. There's a system to it, a bureaucratic quality. Elisabeth was the administrator of suffering. She made cruelty efficient and organized. One survivor testified that when Elisabeth caught a prisoner eating stolen vegetables, she forced her to kneel holding the food overhead for 4 hours. When the woman's arms gave out, Elisabeth beat her unconscious and forbade anyone from helping her until nightfall. Notice the pattern in Elisabeth's cruelty. There's always a rule book, a system, a punishment that ostensibly fits the crime. This is what philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, evil that presents itself as bureaucratic efficiency, as following procedures, as maintaining order. Elisabeth could tell herself she wasn't being cruel. She was maintaining discipline, enforcing rules, doing her job properly and efficiently. Johanna's method was psychologically revealing in a different way. She used her dog as an extension of her will. She didn't personally tear people apart. Her dog did. What does this tell us about her psychology? It's a form of psychological distancing. She could cause extreme suffering while maintaining the fiction that she wasn't really doing it personally. The dog was doing it. She was just failing to stop the dog. Or she couldn't control the dog. Or the dog acted on its own. During one death march from a sub-camp to Auschwitz, a prisoner with an infected leg couldn't keep pace with the others. Johanna ordered her dog to attack. The woman was literally torn apart by the animal. When confronted about this at her trial, Johanna claimed that it was against camp regulations to use dogs against prisoners, that she would have been punished for doing so. Think about the psychology of that defense. In a system designed for mass murder, where gas chambers operated daily, where people were worked to death and starved to death and beaten to death, she expected people to believe she'd face punishment for a dog attack. This reveals complete moral disconnection. She could see the rules, could cite the regulations, but couldn't see the reality of what she'd participated in. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that her brain protected itself by creating this alternate reality where she was just a rule-following employee who would never deliberately break regulations. To fully understand the three women, we need to briefly examine the man who commanded Bergen-Belsen, Josef Kramer, because he represents a different psychological type that's equally important to understanding genocide. Kramer wasn't traumatized like Irma. He wasn't motivated by money like Elisabeth. He wasn't just going along with the environment like Johanna. Kramer was a true believer bureaucrat, someone who genuinely believed in the Nazi ideology and saw himself as a professional administrator doing important work for the Reich. Born in 1906 in Munich to a middle-class Catholic family, Kramer joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS in 1932. His career was a steady progression through the camp system. Dachau in 1934, Sachsenhausen in 1936, Mauthausen in 1940, Auschwitz from 1940 to 1944, and finally Bergen-Belsen from 1944 to 1945. At each stop, he proved himself capable of greater atrocity, and each success led to a promotion. At Natzweiler Struthof camp in France, Kramer personally gassed 80 Jews who had been selected for a skeleton collection at the Reich University in Strasbourg. This wasn't some abstract administrative task. He was in the room. He watched them die. When asked about this at his trial, he described it with clinical precision. They continued breathing for approximately half a minute before dying. No horror, no guilt, no acknowledgement that he'd just murdered 80 people. Just technical details about timing. This is what psychologists call extreme compartmentalization, the ability to completely separate the human reality from the administrative task. Kramer saw himself as a professional doing a job, following orders, maintaining efficiency. The fact that his job involved mass murder didn't register as morally significant in his framework. He was serving the Reich, following the Führer, doing his duty. The content of that duty, the fact that it involved killing millions of people, was irrelevant to his self-conception as a loyal, efficient administrator. When Kramer transferred to Bergen-Belsen in December 1944, he brought several of his most effective guards with him from Auschwitz, including Irma, Elisabeth, and another female guard named Herta Ehlert. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen had transformed from a prisoner-of-war camp into what can only be described as an open-air morgue where people were sent to die slowly. The numbers tell the story of administrative collapse and deliberate neglect. The camp was designed for 10,000 people. By March 1945, it held over 60,000. Food rations had been cut to far below starvation level. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery swept through the barracks unchecked. The daily death rate reached 500 people. Corpses lay everywhere in the barracks, along the paths, piled outside like garbage. And here's what's psychologically revealing. Even in this chaos, even as German defeat became inevitable and everyone knew the war was lost, the three women continued their patterns of cruelty. Irma still shot prisoners arbitrarily for minor infractions, or for no reason at all. Elisabeth still implemented her sports torture sessions. Johanna still used her dog to terrorize inmates. Why? The answer reveals something crucial about their psychology. The system that had shaped them was still functioning, even as it collapsed. They still had their roles. They still had their power. They still had their routines, and those roles had become their identity. They literally didn't know how to be anything else anymore. Who was Irma without her whip and her power? Who was Elisabeth without her administrative authority? Who was Johanna without her position? They'd spent years constructing identities around these roles, and even as the Third Reich crumbled around them, they kept playing those roles because the alternative, acknowledging what they'd become, was psychologically unbearable. April 15, 1945. British forces enter Bergen-Belsen. They find approximately 13,000 unburied corpses and 60,000 dying prisoners. BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby transmitted his famous description to the world. Here across more than 1 acre of ground lie the dead and the dying. One cannot tell which is which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and all around them moved the ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. But here's what shocked the British liberators even more than the corpses and the dying prisoners. The guards were still there. Kramer and many of his staff, including the three women, hadn't fled. They remained at their posts. Why? Psychological analysis suggests several interconnected factors. First, reality distortion. They'd spent so long in the camp system So many years in this alternate reality where mass death was normal that they couldn't imagine a world where they'd be held accountable. They'd been told they were doing important work, following orders, serving the Reich. In their minds, they'd done nothing wrong. Second, authority identification. Their identity was so completely bound to their role that fleeing would mean psychological death, an acknowledgement that everything they'd done was wrong, that they'd wasted years of their life, that they'd become monsters. The human brain will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid that kind of self-knowledge. Third, normalization. They genuinely believed, at some level, that they'd done nothing wrong. They were just following orders, just doing their jobs, just maintaining discipline. When Kramer presented himself to British officers, he actually expected them to appreciate his efforts to maintain order in difficult circumstances. The cognitive disconnect from moral reality was absolute and complete. Within hours of liberation, survivors began identifying guards to the British soldiers. That one, they'd say, pointing at Irma. The blonde one. She selected my sister for the gas chambers. She beat my friend to death. She shot women for fun. That one, pointing at Elisabeth. She beat my mother until she couldn't stand. Then beat her more. She made us exercise until we died. That one, pointing at Johanna. Her dog tore apart my friend who couldn't walk fast enough. The British arrested all 3 women on April 17th, along with Kramer and 42 other staff members. Then came what some survivors called poetic justice. The British forced the captured guards to bury the thousands of corpses scattered across the camp. Historical photographs show them carrying bodies, their faces revealing their psychology in this moment. Irma appears tense but defiant, her expression suggesting she still didn't believe this was really happening to her. Elisabeth is visibly distressed, vomiting during the work, her body rejecting what her mind had normalized for years. Johanna works mechanically, her face blank, as if she'd shut down emotionally entirely. British soldiers reported that Irma handled the corpses with evident disdain, as if they were inanimate objects, not human remains. Even faced with the physical evidence of tens of thousands of deaths, even handling the bodies of people she'd helped murder, she showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of responsibility, no recognition that these had been human beings. The psychological walls she'd built were too strong, too necessary for her functioning, to break down even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The photographs and film footage from Belsen shocked the world, creating one of the first widespread public awareness of the Holocaust's scope. This was before Nuremberg, before most people really understood what had happened in the camps. The images of corpses stacked like wood, of skeletal survivors barely alive, of mass graves, went around the world. And particularly striking to people were the images of the female guards, especially Irma, young and blonde and beautiful, carrying corpses. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for people trying to process it. How could someone who looked like she could be a fashion model be a mass murderer? How could a woman, associated in most people's minds with nurturing and motherhood, participate in genocide? The images created a psychological crisis for viewers because they challenged fundamental assumptions about evil, about gender, about what monsters look like. September 17, 1945. Lüneburg, Germany. 45 people stand accused of crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Among them, Josef Kramer, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, and 8 other female guards. The trial would last 54 days, creating one of the first extensive records of Holocaust atrocities and establishing crucial precedents for international justice. Lead prosecutor. Colonel T.M. Backhouse was furious with what he'd seen at Belsen and determined to secure convictions. In his opening statement, he told the court, "Can this court for one moment believe that the persons engaged in this deliberate extermination did not know that what they were doing was wrong and contrary to every law and custom of war? His prosecution strategy was methodical. Present overwhelming survivor testimony, document the systematic nature of the crimes, demolish the defense of just following orders. The three women adopted different defense strategies that reveal their psychological states. Irma went with partial denial combined with the following orders defense. She admitted to beating prisoners but claimed it was necessary to maintain discipline. She denied participating in selections for gas chambers, even though dozens of survivors testified they'd watched her do exactly that. She claimed she didn't know what the gas chambers were for, even though she worked at Auschwitz for years, and the smell of burning bodies was constant. When confronted directly with specific testimony about her shooting prisoners, her ordering her dog to attack women, her selecting beautiful women for death, her response was chilling in its banality. Discipline had to be maintained. No acknowledgement that beating starving prisoners to death isn't discipline. No recognition that ordering your dog to tear someone apart isn't maintaining order. The psychological compartmentalization was complete. Throughout the trial, Irma maintained what observers called an arrogant and unremorseful demeanor. She glared at witnesses who testified against her. She gave terse, dismissive responses to questions. British soldiers guarding her nicknamed her Jut Jaw for her belligerent attitude, her jutting jaw suggesting defiance rather than remorse. The only time she showed vulnerability was when her sister Helene testified as a character witness, describing the confrontation with their father. At that moment, Irma broke down sobbing, but importantly, she was crying for her lost relationship with her father, not for her victims. Elisabeth adopted a strategy of complete denial combined with claimed ignorance. "I never knew about gas chambers," she insisted repeatedly. When asked how she could work at Auschwitz for years and not know about the gas chambers that operated daily, she claimed she thought selected people were being sent to work elsewhere. When asked why people selected for work would never return, why the smell of burning bodies was constant, why prisoners lived in terror of selections, she had no credible answers. Multiple survivors testified to Elisabeth's systematic brutality. Doris Safran described watching Elisabeth beat an elderly woman to death for being unable to stand during a prolonged roll call. She dragged her down the stairs and kicked her repeatedly while she lay motionless on the ground, Safran testified. When confronted with this testimony, Elisabeth denied it mechanically, but her denials lacked any conviction in the face of detailed, consistent testimony from multiple independent witnesses. Johanna's attorney tried to portray her as a powerless middle-aged woman trapped in circumstances beyond her control, just following orders to survive. This argument collapsed when survivor after survivor described her deliberately ordering her dog to attack prisoners. Alexandra Sawida's testimony was particularly damning. She described watching Johanna's dog tear into a woman with an infected leg during a march from a sub-camp. The woman was put on a stretcher, her injuries clearly fatal. Johanna watched it happen and did nothing to stop it. When asked about using her dog as a weapon, Johanna claimed it was against camp regulations to use dogs against prisoners and that she would have been punished for doing so. The prosecutor pointed out the obvious absurdity. In a camp where the regulations included sending people to gas chambers, where mass murder was policy, she expected the court to believe she'd face punishment for a dog attack. Johanna had no response. The cognitive dissonance was too extreme for her to address directly. The survivor testimony was devastating in its detail and consistency. 121 witnesses testified, many describing specific incidents with dates, locations, and circumstances. Helena Koper testified that Irma selected at least 30 prisoners daily for death during 7 months supervising a punishment detail at Birkenau. Vera Fischer testified that Elisabeth beat her so severely she needed 3 weeks hospitalization. Abraham Glinowiecki testified watching Irma send both sick and healthy Hungarian Jews to gas chambers during selections. November 16, 1945. After 6 hours of deliberation, the court returned its verdicts. 30 defendants guilty, 14 defendants acquitted, 11 defendants sentenced to death. Irma Grese, guilty of crimes at both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Death by hanging. Elisabeth Volkenrath, guilty of crimes at both camps. Death by hanging. Johanna Bormann, guilty of crimes at Auschwitz. Death by hanging. Josef Kramer, guilty. Death by hanging. When the sentence was translated into German, Tode durch den Strang, death by the rope, their reactions revealed their psychological states in that moment. Irma showed no visible emotion. Her face remained set in that defiant expression she'd maintained throughout the trial. Elisabeth appeared shocked, as if she genuinely hadn't believed this outcome was possible. Johanna seemed to disconnect from reality entirely, her expression blank, as if her mind had simply stopped processing what was happening. The international press coverage focused particularly on Irma, with headlines like "The Beautiful Beast Sentenced to Death" and "22-year-old Blonde to Hang for Nazi Crimes." The media fascination with her appearance, her youth, her gender, revealed society's struggle to process the idea that someone who looked like her could commit such atrocities. Public reaction was mixed. British audiences largely approved, seeing it as justice served. German audiences were surprised that 14 had been acquitted, many having assumed everyone charged would be automatically convicted. Survivor communities were devastated that more guards hadn't received death sentences and that many guards who had participated in atrocities received only prison terms or were never charged at all. The feeling among survivors was that justice was incomplete, that hundreds of perpetrators would escape accountability, and they were right. Irma appealed her sentence, requesting a new trial. The appeal was denied after brief consideration. For the next month, the condemned waited in Hamelin prison. According to one account, on the night before her execution, Irma and Johanna sang Nazi songs together. Even at the very end, facing death in hours, they remained defiant, clinging to the ideology that had shaped them, unable or unwilling to acknowledge what they'd become. The British government summoned Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, to carry out the sentences. Pierrepoint was a third-generation hangman who would eventually execute over 400 people during his career, including approximately 200 Nazi war criminals. On December 12th, the day before the executions, Pierrepoint and his assistant, Regimental Sergeant Major Richard O'Neill, met with each condemned prisoner to take measurements necessary to calculate the drop distance for an instantaneous death. Pierrepoint later wrote about meeting Irma in his memoir. RSM O'Neill ordered, "Bring out Irma Grese." She walked out of her cell and came towards us laughing. She seemed as bonny a girl as one could ever wish to meet. When asked her age, Irma paused and smiled. Even on the eve of her execution, even after being convicted of mass murder, she maintained that moment of feminine vanity about revealing her age. 21, she finally said. Schnell, she told them when asked to step on the scales. Quick, hurry up. Still trying to maintain control, still directing others, still playing her role. Pierrepoint measured her at 165 centimeters tall, 68 kilograms in weight. From these measurements, he calculated she would need a drop of 2.24 meters to ensure instantaneous death by cervical fracture. Elisabeth Volkenrath was measured next, approximately 162 centimeters, 65 kilograms. She was subdued, answering in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact, her earlier shock having settled into resignation. Johanna Bormann appeared old and haggard, according to Pierrepoint's account. She limped down the corridor, trembling visibly. As she stepped on the scale, she said in German, "Ich habe meine Gefühle." I have my feelings. It's the only time anyone recorded her acknowledging any emotion at all throughout this entire process. December 13, 1945. The execution chamber at Hamelin Prison was ready. At 9:34 a.m., Brigadier Peyton Walsh stood with his watch raised. Alongside him was Miss Wilson, Deputy Governor of Strangeways Prison, present to oversee the hanging of the three women. The protocol was precise. Women first, executed individually, then the men in pairs. Pierre Point walked into the corridor and called the first name. Elisabeth Volkenrath. She came first. At 9:34 a.m., she was led to the gallows. The trap door opened. Death was instantaneous by cervical fracture. At 10:03 a.m., it was Irma's turn. Pierre Point called her name. The guards quickly closed the observation ports on the other cells and opened Irma's door. The cell was far too small for me to go inside, Pierre Point later wrote, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. "Follow me," I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. She walked to the execution chamber without resistance. She looked for a moment at the officers standing at attention around the room. Then she walked to the chalk mark on the trap door, the exact center where she needed to stand. As Pierre Point placed the white hood over her head, blocking her vision for the last seconds of her life, she said one final time, "Schnell! Quick!" The trap door opened. At age 22, Irma Grese died at the end of a rope, her neck broken instantly by the calculated drop. At 10:38 a.m., Johanna Bormann became the third and final woman executed that day. She appeared physically weak, requiring assistance to climb the scaffold steps. The execution proceeded according to protocol. Death was instantaneous. After the women, Kramer and the other condemned men were hanged in pairs. Kramer went at 12:11 p.m., along with Dr. Fritz Klein. By 4:17 p.m., all 11 executions were complete. The bodies were cremated. Their ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, likely within the prison grounds, to prevent any graves from becoming pilgrimage sites for neo-Nazis in the future. Among Irma's possessions, authorities found approximately 440 Reichsmarks in cash, and a bank book showing a balance of 4,400 Reichsmarks. This was an enormous sum for someone her age. Remember, an ordinary textile worker earned about 76 Reichsmarks per month. Irma had saved the equivalent of nearly 5 years' wages. The money came from her work as a guard. Cruelty had literally paid, had provided her with financial security and upward mobility. These possessions were returned to family members when they could be located. Irma's father, Alfred, who had disowned her and thrown her out of his house years earlier, reportedly wanted nothing to do with her effects or memory. He would live until 1979, carrying the knowledge that his daughter had become one of history's most notorious war criminals. Now we need to address the uncomfortable truth that all this research, all these case studies, all this psychological analysis points to. And this is the part that most people resist, that makes people angry, that challenges our fundamental beliefs about ourselves. Here's what we want to believe: that Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were aberrations, monsters, uniquely evil individuals whose capacity for cruelty was somehow fundamentally different from ours. We want to believe there's something wrong with them that isn't wrong with us, some essential evil in their nature that we don't share. But decades of psychological research tells a very different story. The Stanford prison experiment in 1971 showed that ordinary college students randomly assigned to be guards became sadistic within days. The Milgram obedience studies showed that 65% of ordinary Americans would deliver what they believed were lethal electric shocks when instructed by an authority figure. The studies of genocide in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, all show the same pattern. Ordinary people committing extraordinary atrocities when placed in certain environmental and social conditions. The research is consistent, and it's clear. Most people, given the right circumstances, are capable of becoming like these three women. This isn't speculation. This is scientific consensus based on decades of research across multiple disciplines. And those circumstances aren't as extreme as you might think. You don't need to be born evil. You don't need to be mentally ill. You don't need to be ideologically indoctrinated from birth. What you need is, first, social pressure and conformity to group norms. Second, authority structures that provide orders and remove personal responsibility. Third, ideological justification that frames cruelty as necessary or righteous. Fourth, dehumanization of victims through language and propaganda. Fifth, gradual escalation that normalizes increasingly extreme behavior. Sixth, rewards for cruelty and punishments for compassion. Given those 6 factors, psychological research suggests that the majority of people will participate in atrocities. Not everyone, but most. This is what should terrify you. Not that these 3 women were monsters, but that they were ordinary people transformed by circumstances that could transform you too under the right conditions. Irma wasn't born with some evil gene. She was a traumatized farm girl who found power and belonging in an evil system. Elisabeth wasn't inherently sadistic. She was an ordinary working-class woman seeking upward mobility who made moral compromises in small increments until she became a murderer. Johanna wasn't a demon. She was a middle-aged woman who needed a job and gradually lost her humanity in an environment that rewarded cruelty. The system transformed them. The environment rewarded their worst impulses and punished their better ones. Over time, they became what the system needed them to be. And here's the crucial point. That same transformation could happen to you. This isn't an insult. It's a warning based on scientific evidence. What makes you different from Irma? You might say your values, your morality, your conscience. But Irma had values before the camps. She wanted to be a nurse to help people. Johanna did missionary work, believed in God, in charity. They had values and morality too, before the environment eroded those values gradually. You might say you'd resist, you'd refuse orders, you'd maintain your humanity. But 65% of Milgram's subjects didn't resist. The Stanford guards didn't resist. Most people don't resist when the pressure is real and the costs are high. You might say you're too educated, too aware, too psychologically sophisticated to fall for propaganda. But education doesn't protect you. Many Nazi perpetrators were educated. Doctors, lawyers, professors participated in genocide. Intelligence doesn't make you immune to these psychological mechanisms, so if most people are vulnerable to these transformations, what makes the difference? Who are the people who do resist? Psychological research on moral rebels, people who resist systemic evil even at great personal cost, identifies several factors. First, a strong pre-existing moral framework, often religious or philosophical, that they actively maintain even under pressure. Second, social support from like-minded people. You can't resist alone. You need a community that reinforces your values. Third, the ability to see victims as individuals rather than categories. Maintaining humanization even when everyone around you is dehumanizing. Fourth, willingness to sacrifice status, career, even life for moral principles. True moral courage. The guards who remained humane at camps typically had strong religious convictions they actively maintained, connections to family or communities outside the camp system that reinforced human values, conscious practices of seeing prisoners as individuals with names and stories, and willingness to face consequences for showing mercy. Irma had none of these protective factors. Her trauma isolated her. Her ideology dehumanized victims. Her identity became completely bound to her role as a guard. She had no external community reinforcing humane values. Elisabeth had none of these factors. She'd made a purely economic calculation and had no moral framework to fall back on when the escalation began. Johanna initially had religious convictions, but she'd isolated herself from any community that could reinforce those values, and the camp environment gradually eroded her faith. The ones who became monsters were the ones who lost their connection to humanity, to community, to moral frameworks bigger than themselves. And here's what that means practically. If you want to ensure you don't become like them, you need to actively maintain those connections. You need community. You need moral frameworks you practice daily. You need to consciously resist dehumanization in all its forms. You need to speak up early when you see concerning patterns, because by the time it's obvious, it's often too late. Now let me tell you about Albert Pierre Point, because his story adds a crucial epilogue to all of this. Remember, he's the executioner who hanged all 3 women, plus Kramer, and hundreds of other war criminals. He was Britain's chief executioner for over 20 years, hanging over 400 people. In 1974, nearly 30 years after the Belsen executions, Pierre Point published his memoirs. And he wrote something remarkable, something that challenges everything about how we think about justice and punishment and revenge. He wrote, "All the men and women whom I have faced at that final moment convince me that in what I have done, I have not prevented a single murder. Executions solve nothing and are only an antiquated relic of a primitive desire for revenge." Think about that. The man who executed over 400 people, including history's most notorious war criminals, concluded that capital punishment was pointless, that it solved nothing, that it was just revenge disguised as justice. Did hanging Irma Grese bring back a single one of her victims? Did executing Elisabeth Volkenrath prevent future genocides? Did killing Johanna Bormann restore any justice to the world? The answer to all those questions is no. But here's what the Belsen trial did accomplish. And this is important. First, it established the principle of individual responsibility for participation in genocide. You can't hide behind just following orders. You made choices, and you bear responsibility for those choices. Second, it demonstrated that following orders is not a legal defense for crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg principles that followed built on this foundation. Third, it showed that gender provides no immunity from justice. Women who participate in genocide face the same accountability as men. Fourth, it created a historical record. The testimonies, the evidence, the verdicts, all documented what happened in ways that couldn't be denied later. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, it forced the world to confront the fact that ordinary people commit genocide. Not monsters, not psychopaths, but ordinary humans under certain conditions. So why does any of this matter in 2025? Why should you care about 3 women who died 80 years ago? Because the psychological factors that created Irma Grese still exist in our world today. Childhood trauma without adequate treatment creates vulnerable people seeking power and belonging. Economic desperation makes immoral choices attractive when they offer financial security. Ideologies that offer belonging through hatred of others recruit new members. Daily. Power structures with insufficient accountability create environments where cruelty goes unpunished. Gradual normalization of cruelty happens in many contexts, not just concentration camps. The names change. The uniforms change. The specific ideologies change. The targets of dehumanization change. But human psychology remains constant across time and culture. Every study, every experiment, every historical analysis tells us the same thing. Most people, given the right circumstances, are capable of becoming like these 3 women. You want to believe you'd be different. You want to believe you'd be the hero, the resistor, the one who maintains humanity against all pressure. But statistically, you probably wouldn't be. And that's not a condemnation of you personally. That's a warning based on evidence about human psychology. So the question isn't whether you could become like Irma Grese under the right circumstances. The research suggests you probably could. The question is, what are you doing right now to prevent those circumstances from arising, for you and for society? Are you recognizing and addressing trauma in yourself and others instead of letting it fester and create vulnerabilities? Are you questioning authority rather than blindly following orders and deferring responsibility? Are you maintaining connections to moral communities that reinforce humane values? Are you practicing seeing people as individuals rather than category members, resisting the dehumanization that happens in political discourse, social media, everyday interactions? Are you speaking up when you see early signs of dehumanization, of normalization of cruelty, of gradual moral erosion? Because that's how you resist. Not through dramatic heroism in some hypothetical future where you face an obvious moral crisis, but through daily choices right now to maintain your humanity and recognize the humanity in others, even people you disagree with, even people you don't like, even people your social group has decided are acceptable targets. Let me leave you with one final image that encapsulates everything we've discussed. It's not Irma on the gallows. It's not the corpses at Bergen-Belsen. It's not the trial or the verdict or the execution. It's this: a 13-year-old girl finding her mother dying from acid poisoning in their small farmhouse in rural Germany. That girl was a victim. Her trauma was real. Her pain was real. Her powerlessness was real. She deserves compassion for what happened to her as a child. But trauma doesn't excuse what came after. It explains the vulnerability. It clarifies the pathway, but it doesn't justify the choices. Somewhere between that traumatized child in 1935 and the woman who said Schnell on the gallows in 1945, there were hundreds of moments where different choices could have been made. Moments where she could have sought help for her trauma instead of nursing her rage. Moments where she could have questioned the ideology instead of embracing it. Moments where she could have refused the power instead of wielding it. Moments where she could have maintained her humanity instead of abandoning it. She didn't make those choices. But you can. Every single day, you face micro-versions of those same choices. Do you dehumanize people who disagree with you politically? Or do you maintain their humanity even in disagreement? Do you follow authority blindly when orders seem wrong? Or do you question and resist? Do you normalize cruelty in small ways through your language, your jokes, your social media posts? Or do you resist that normalization? Do you seek belonging through hatred of outgroups? Or do you find community through shared values and genuine connection? The path from ordinary person to monster is paved with small compromises, tiny moral erosions that seem insignificant in the moment but accumulate over time into something unrecognizable. And the path from ordinary person to moral hero is paved with small acts of resistance, daily choices to maintain humanity when it would be easier to abandon it. Every single day you're on one of those paths. Every interaction, every choice, every moment of moral decision, you're moving in one direction or the other. Which path are you on right now? Which direction are you moving? And most importantly, what are you going to do about it tomorrow when you face the next choice, the next moment, the next opportunity to either maintain your humanity or compromise it just a little bit more? Because that's what this story is really about. Not 3 women who died 80 years ago, but you, right now, today, making choices that determine who you become. The question isn't what you would have done in 1945. The question is what you're doing in 2025, every single day, to ensure you don't become what they became. That's the uncomfortable truth. That's the warning. That's the lesson. Are you listening?